All right, welcome to Ecclesiology Part 2. I do have another video to share with you after this one. We'll get to that at the end. So we left off last time talking about how Jesus in this passage is giving Peter an important responsibility. But the way that the passage is worded, it's kind of mysterious. It's hard to kind of figure out what is going on here. But the first thing to notice is he asks Simon Peter, how many times do you love me? And he asks him 3 times, right? And what does that make us think of? Well, it should make us think of that this is the same guy who denied Jesus 3 times, a couple days before this, right? So what's the significance of that? Well, in a sense, by asking Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me? Do you love me? He's undoing this denial of Jesus, right? He's making up for it, I guess, and this is one way to think about it, okay? He's also re-emphasizing that Peter has a special role, right? So, what are the 2 great commandments according to Christ, right? It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, look at the questions he asks. He says, do you love me? Yes. And then what does he say? Feed my lambs. Do you love me? Yes. Tend my sheep. Do you love me? Yes. Feed my sheep. So in each case, he's making Peter kind of fulfill both of those commandments, right? He's saying, okay, great, you love me. Now here's what you have to do. Great, you love me. Now love your neighbor, right? And he does it 3 times over and over again. Lastly, second to last, we have this idea that this imagery of feeding my sheep, tending my sheep, right? Now, what is that about? Well, we know that Jesus has identified himself as the good shepherd, right? And so in a sense, he's kind of giving that responsibility to Peter. He's saying, all right, I'm the good shepherd, but here's the church. Now it's your turn to be the shepherd when I am gone, okay? And lastly, this is just kind of an interesting note. We're not going to get too far into it, but the New Testament's written in Greek, and in Greek, unlike in English, there's multiple words for love and different kinds of love. And in this passage, again, I don't have the Greek here, but Jesus uses different words for love throughout this passage, right? And so one of the things that scholars have said is he's kind of calling Peter every time he asks him from sort of like a friendship kind of love to a really intimate, deeper kind of love, right? So when he's asking him over and over again, he's calling him into a deeper and deeper relationship. Okay, and the last thing that we can note that shows that Jesus set Peter aside for a special responsibility is that he prays for Peter, okay? And we'll read this passage here in just a second. That an argument broke out among them about which of them should be regarded as the greatest. He said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are addressed as benefactors. But among you it shall not be so. Rather, let the greatest among you be as the youngest, and the leader as the servant. For who is greater, the one seated at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one seated at the table? I am among you as the one who serves. In other words, I've given you this example. It is you who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer a kingdom on you, just as my Father has conferred one on me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he says this, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to sift all of you, plural, like wheat, all the apostles. And here's what he says, but I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And once you have turned back, you must strengthen your brothers. One of the things that I love about this is it gives us kind of an image of what leadership should be about, right? So it's interesting, right? The apostles are arguing, right? I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. And Jesus doesn't deny that there is a greatest, but he does say, let the greatest among you be like the youngest and like a servant, right? He's really talking about this sort of servant type of leader, like he has been to them, right? And then he points out Peter and he says, yet Satan's demanded, he's trying to sift all of you. He's really attacking you. But I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith may not fail. And once you have turned back, in other words, once you've turned back after denying me, you have a job to do, okay? And this is just kind of a nice little note at the end. But one of the titles of the Pope has many titles, but I think this might be one of my favorite ones. It's Servant of the Servants of God, right? And part of that comes directly from this passage. So we can see over and over and over again, right, that the church is one, and this figure, this Bishop of Rome, first established as Peter, is set apart from the apostles, and he has this special role, right? Now, one quick question. Why is Peter the Bishop of Rome? Well, it's the easy answer, because that's where he and the Apostle Paul were martyred in the 60s AD, and that's also why they're given special veneration in the Roman rite of the church. You will notice when you go to Mass today that there's two like larger than life statues right at the front, and who are they? They're Peter and Paul. And it's because we are in the Roman Catholic Church, and those two saints founded the Roman Church. Now, it's an important thing to mention that, okay, yes, even if you acknowledge, okay, yes, Peter had this special role among the apostles and in the early church, but what reasons do we have to think that continued, right? Maybe that special role just ended at the martyrdom of Peter. Aha. But, excuse me, we have lots of documents, lots of letters from the early church fathers which show over and over again that the Church of Rome continues to have this special authority. And I'm going to give you just two examples. This is St. Ignatius of Antioch, right around 110 AD, and he is a bishop, right? And here's how he addresses the Church of Rome in 110 AD. To the church which also holds the presidency in the place of the country of the Romans, worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of blessing, worthy of praise, worthy of success, worthy of sanctification, and because you hold the presidency of love, named after Christ and named after the Father, here therefore do I salute in the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father. I mean, when you read that, right, here's a bishop writing to another bishop. And again, this is Ignatius of Antioch. So he's the first one who actually uses the term Catholic to describe the Christian church, at least the first record we have of it, right around the same time that he wrote this. But if you read this, it sure doesn't sound like, it's a bishop talking to another equal, right? He's clearly using this very elevated language because he holds this Bishop of Rome in such high esteem, right? Another quick example. This is a letter of Pope St. Clement. Okay, Clement was the fourth pope, and he wrote a letter to the Corinthians. It's not in the Bible, though there was debate in the early church whether this should be included in the New Testament. And here's what he says. I'm not going to read it, but I'll just summarize what's going on here. So he's responding to a letter from the Corinthians, and we don't have that letter, but we have this response of his. And here's what's interesting about it. And this is, again, estimated around AD 80, okay? So in that time, the Apostle John, who lived in Ephesus, was still alive. So the Corinthians are writing not to the Apostle John, who, by the way, lived a lot closer to Corinth. Ephesus was a lot closer to Corinth. But no, they write to the Bishop of Rome to help adjudicate this particular issue that they were having, this dispute, right? Which just is evidence, positive evidence, that even though there was a living apostle, there was something unique and something special about the Bishop of Rome. Okay, that's the first two marks of the church. The church is apostolic, the church is one. Let's move on to the next one. The church is holy. The question that I asked you to respond to was, how would you respond to someone who rejects Christianity and or Catholicism because of various scandals in the church and the hypocritical actions of its members and leadership, right? And I think the best way to respond to this, folks, is just to say this, right? The church is not holy because of the members of the church. The church is holy because Christ is holy, right? And going back to this image of the mystical body, if he is the head of the church and we are his body, right? Well, sometimes the members of the body fail, right? They fail to live up to their call, but that doesn't mean that Christ or his mystical body is unholy, okay? And I think one of the things to consider is, sometimes we ask, how can we say that the church is holy when we see so many examples of its members, people that people that I know, even examples in the news of priests, bishops, in history books of bad popes who don't live up to their call, right? Well, I think it's important to remember that even among the 12 apostles, there was this guy, Judas, right? Someone who was far closer to Christ than any of us will be in a real physical sense, on this side of heaven at least, right? And yet he betrayed him, all right? And if you know anything about the history of the church, right, there's lots, unfortunately, there's lots of Judases, right? There's these key figures who, frankly, don't live up to their call, right? But here's what I'll say. We shouldn't leave Peter because of Judas, right? We shouldn't leave Peter because of Judas, okay? And, the other remarkable thing is when we look at the history of the church and we see some of these scandalous things that members of the church have done over the centuries, these are the times of greatest scandal is when God raises up some of the best saints, okay? And so I think, we said at the beginning, right, that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And here's the reality, is that if the Catholic Church were a merely human institution that relied on the holiness of its members, well, I hate to break it to you, but it would have folded a long time ago, right? But Christ promised that he would be with us to the end of the age, and he promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against it, even when some of its members fail to live up to their calling. Okay, the last mark of the church is that the church is Catholic, okay? Catholic means universal or according to the whole. And the question I asked you was, how has the Catholicity of the church or the universality changed or developed in the last 2,000 years? Well, like the mustard seed, which Jesus talks about and he compares the kingdom of God to, the church began on the foundation of the 12 apostles, right, who represented the 12 tribes of Israel in the Middle East, and is now in virtually every country in the world, right? There's 1.3 billion members of the Catholic Church, okay? And in addition to that, and you may or may not know this, but we are part of the Roman Catholic Church, right? If you were baptized in the Latin Rite. But there are actually 23 different Catholic churches. So these are, regional churches that, some of which were at one time were not in communion with Rome, but all of the 23 different Catholic churches are in communion with the Bishop of Rome. So these are things like Byzantine Catholic, Maronite Catholic, right? And some of them have their own liturgical rites as well, right? And maybe some of you attend those or have been to those. And lastly, we can say the church is Catholic simply because the contributions that the Catholic Church has made to the world and to the Western civilization, specifically, right? So how has the church become universal? Well, the reality is you cannot write the story of Western civilization without making the Catholic Church the cornerstone of that story, okay? And just to give you a couple of examples, right? I mean, it's well known that the Catholic Church is the most charitable organization on planet Earth, right? It helps more people, houses more homeless, is the largest non-government provider of healthcare, the largest non-government provider of education. There's a great book called how the Catholic Church built Western civilization, and it goes into things like how the church invented the university system, how the church invented the legal system. It preserved numerous ancient written works and was the patron of the most celebrated art and architecture in the Western world, right? So we see, all these different examples that show, right, that, when Jesus talked about this mustard seed, right, that grows into this magnificent tree, we see that over the centuries, over the millennium, right? This church that began, on these 12 apostles really has, become, a force for good throughout the world. Okay, two quick notes at the end. We have this image in the Catechism of the church being the bride of Christ, and I just want to talk about that for just a second. Well, we're running out of time, less than 2 minutes, so I'm going to be quick. The imagery of bride and groom comes up again and again. And it's interesting because marriage, right, is another one of those things that is talked about a lot in the Bible. I mean, if you think about it, the Bible begins and ends with a wedding, right? It begins with the marriage, so to speak, of our first parents, and it ends with the wedding feast of the Lamb. And the Catechism has this great line comparing Jesus to Adam. And it says, "As Eve was formed from the sleeping Adam's side, so the church was born from the pierced heart of Christ hanging dead on the cross." Okay. That image, just to kind of break that down. So if you remember when Jesus died on the cross, right, there were two thieves that were crucified with him, and they broke their legs to make sure that they were, to hasten their death, to take them down from the cross. But when they saw that Jesus was already dead, they stabbed him in the lance with a side. And what happened? Blood and water flowed out. Well, the church fathers have always recognized that as sort of an image of the sacraments of baptism and the image of the sacrament of the Eucharist, the blood of Christ, literally in this case. And they made that comparison. Well, here's the new Adam, and as Eve was formed from the sleeping Adam's sign, so the church was born from the pierced heart of Christ hanging dead on the cross. Okay, I have less than 30 seconds, so I'm going to be really quick here. So my last slide, I end on controversy. Not really, but it kind of seems like controversy. So this passage was in your packet, comparing Christ to the church like a marriage. And this is a quote from St. Paul, and it just uses some language that might be difficult for our ears. So I included another video that hopefully can be played after this that just clarifies what do we mean when we say these, subject yourself to one another, or wives be subject to your husbands. Like, what does that actually mean? Okay, going to run out of time. 5 seconds. Thanks. Bye.